Computation Company yani hesaplama şirketi olarak anılan, hesaplama, veri ve bilgi olgularının kesişiminde faaliyet gösteren, Wolfram grubu teknoloji ve çözümler vasıtasıyla veri bilimi, modelleme ve matematik alanlarında inovasyona liderlik eden, Wolfram Research Avrupa'nın kurucusu ve CEO'su, fizikçi, matematikçi, teknolog ve girişimci, Sayın Conrad Wolfram'ı Yapay Zeka için Eğitimi Dönüştürmek başlıklı konuşması için kürsüye davet ediyorum. Sayın Wolfram'a konuşmasının ardından sorularınızı yanıtlayacaktır.
Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also the very interesting talk that we just had, which I think is a good scene setter for what I want to talk about today, which, as I've entitled, is Transforming Education for the AI Age. My day job, as has been described a little bit, has been to build the best computation so that machines can do the best job. But what I want to talk to you about today is the human side of that. How do we make the humans do a better job given the machines have upticked to this new AI age? And I'm going to walk through in some detail over the next 45 minutes or so how I think we can set education on the right track so that we are empowering our students for this future. Well, the first most important thing to ask is, given that the real world changed and is changing, how should education react to that? Clearly, education has to react to a change in the real world. And the thing we need to think about really in some depth is, what is that reaction? We now have machines to do many things. We have a new industrial revolution. What is it that we should be now teaching our students? And I want to focus particularly in this talk on the change of ubiquitous computation. So what do I mean by this? Well, in the outside world now, in most places, particularly in the developed world, people have computing machines with them all the time. So I call that ubiquitous computing. You know, I have right now my computer, I also have my phone, I have the cloud out there through the internet. I have a lot of computation. Basically, all the time I am around, I have computation available to me. And that is a complete change from a few years ago. So we are in a world where we can assume, in many respects, that we have computation available and high-powered computation. And one of the things that's meant is that we apply computation in virtually everything we do. And this will continue. And one of the things I listed here was some of the areas that used not to have computation, but in the last few years have gained it. Prototyping, linguistics, medical imaging, trading, algorithmic trading. A lot of the financial issues of the last few decades have been because computers now do the trading, for better and for worse. Archaeology. Archaeology didn't seem a very technical area a few years ago. Now it's pretty technical. You have lots of computation, people imaging things and so forth. Biology, computational history, computational linguistics. You've noticed I have a theme here, computational X. So most subjects at school and at university in the future, when you think about them, they won't just be history. There'll also be an element which is computational history. How do we think about history from a computational data science point of view, as well as from the traditional way we thought about history? So that's why down here I've said that it's a typical subject will be computational X. Now, most of this talk, I want to talk about the subjects that are going to change. But one of the areas, of course, that will also be affected is the pedagogy of education, how we teach. And as was mentioned in the previous talk, AI will affect how we deliver learning. But what I really want to understand in this talk is what it is we deliver, not just how we deliver it. So I want to give you a very simple example of where ubiquitous computation is just present now, all the time. So what I'm going to ask for here is a list of all the places in the human genome where that sequence of base pairs exists. Yeah, I'll put it down here, thank you. So this is all the places. I just typed onto my laptop computer this sequence of base pairs through our Wolfram language, and you can see here is a list of all the chromosomes and all the positions where that sequence appeared. Now, it's amazing. In a few seconds, I've pulled that up from my laptop with some data from the cloud, some computation. The fact that that's available to me straight off there is amazing. A few decades ago, we thought it wasn't even possible to sequence the human genome. Now I can pull it up in a few seconds. That's obviously science, biology, but actually there are many areas where you might think about looking computationally at things which are not necessarily science. This was a colleague of mine, and the book Lord of the Flies, and he decided with his daughter that they would analyze the sentiments through the book. And so they would think about whether whether people are happy or sad, how the characters appear during the book. Apparently the beast appears a lot in the middle of the book and then not so much at the end. And then further down here, whether it's a happy or a sad book, and whether everything seems to go wrong at the end, in this case, a bit of a miserable book. But the point is that normally you wouldn't think of looking at literature from a computational point of view. This is another way of thinking about how you might analyze literature. Again, it's a sort of different new way. Here's an example from history. This was a post that somebody did about how we can look at what different US presidents have said and how we can think about their inaugural addresses. So what issues did they bring up? Trump versus Obama. You can see the words that they thought were most significant at the beginning. And then you can start to analyze for past presidents what actually happened. So the point about this is, I'm not saying this replaces the ways of thinking that we have done traditionally, but it adds to them. It's a new way to analyze what's happened in the world. So I talk about computation and computational thinking being very important. But the key subfield here I'm talking about, in a sense, is data science. Data science has been really successful in the last few years at applying, in a sense, it's taking data and it's applying computation to data to get results. And it's sort of, you should think of data science as a very big area, but not the complete area that computation can offer. There's also modeling. There are also different approaches which are not just about data. But data is the one that's really been significant in the last few years because computers are now so powerful. And one of the great challenges we have for society is what I'm calling citizen data analysts. So all of us have to be able to handle how to interact with data and a computer. Not just interact with raw data, not just look at a spreadsheet of numbers, but be able to take a whole picture of data and say, with my computer, let's see whether we can understand some decisions we would take based on that data. And the way, by the way, to think about all of this is, in the end, all of this computation, all of this data science, what you want in the end is decisions. You're trying to take better decisions in life. That's the point of all of this, decision making, and both individually and as a society. And if you have better analysis, better data science, better computation, better AI, you can potentially make better decisions about what to do. So one way I want to look at this, which I think is helpful with respect to what we want in education, is to think about two ends of the spectrum. So end one is survival skills. In the modern world, what skills do we need just to survive in our societies? So, I mean, hundreds of years ago, we needed to know how to light a fire to stop an animal coming into our cave, right? In most places in the world, that's not the most significant survival skill. I'm not very good at lighting fires, unfortunately. But so what are those skills today? That's question one. And question two other end of the spectrum, what are the real added value skills that we can add as humans as against what the computers give us? What is it that we can not just survive, but what can we do well at? What are the top jobs? What are the top ways we can succeed as humans? And so those two ends of the spectrum, I think, are useful at framing what I think is a key skill that we're not currently well empowered for, which is computational thinking. How do we think computationally about the world? The sorts of things I was just showing you. Are most people in our society set up to be able to think in this sort of logical way, using the power of computers, using the power of data science and AI that's going to come to us? And in particular, in schools and in education around the world, have we got a core subject that really helps humans to get to this level of computational thinking? And that's what I want to talk through now. Now, the subject that you would hope was most closely set up for this is mathematics, maths education. You know, mathematics is the computational subject right now that's the mainstream subject in schools. And I want to talk a bit about how I think we can improve mathematics so that it really fulfills this new role that it needs of computational thinking for the AI age. So is mathematics working right now as this subject? And I'm going to say, not really. I think that the subject has got about 80% different from what we're going to need in terms of the actual content of the subject. Not how it's taught, but the actual content, the curriculum. And I'm going to call this the maths education problem. And by the way, this is not in any way a problem in Turkey versus another country. This is a worldwide issue that the core subject of mathematics that in virtually every country is a compulsory subject for many people to study, I think is a subject that needs adjustment to a new subject so that we can really prepare people for the AI age. Now, unsurprisingly, you might ask, what's the difference between the subject I'm talking about and the subject today that people learn in schools? And the difference is pretty simple to state. Computers and whether computers are doing the calculating. So here's what I mean. When you apply mathematics in all the areas I was showing earlier, in the real world, computers do almost all the calculating. It's very, very rare to have a person calculate things. They do a little bit for estimating, they do a little bit for very basic arithmetic. But more or less, in the world now, with ubiquitous computing, computers calculate, and humans set up the problems to calculate. In education, in schools, this is almost entirely reversed. Almost all our maths education in schools is to do with learning how to calculate by hand. How do I add up? How do I multiply? How do I solve an equation? How do I sketch a graph? These skills you do not use directly anymore in the outside world. You use different skills. And that fundamental difference is what I believe is at the root cause of the divergence between maths education in schools and mathematics use, computational use, data science in the outside world. So let me talk through this in a little bit more detail. Why are we teaching maths to everyone? What is the point of this? Why does everyone in the world pretty much have to learn mathematics? Well, I think there are three good reasons for this, if it's the right subject. And we've sort of talked about these a little bit. The first reason is technical jobs. The most empowering jobs now and into the future require computational understanding. The second reason is what I would call everyday living. Just the survival skill. Can we survive in our society? Can we understand the data we're given? Can we make good decisions for ourselves based on understanding how to think about the information that we are provided with and the interaction with computers? That's very important. How do we interact? Do we know properly how to interact with the AI? And the third reason, I would say, is related to the other two, is what you might call logical thinking, the ability to learn how to think. Now, mathematics has long been associated with that skill, as have other subjects, philosophy, classics, learning Latin in the past. These were all subjects that were supposed to help thinking. And thinking is important because, again, you need to be able to reason, and I think history has shown us when people can reason better, they tend on the whole, not always, but they tend to make better decisions. So let's also talk about what is mathematics. When you are doing maths or learning maths, what are you actually doing? Well, I think you can summarize it in a 4-step process. So the first step is you are defining a question. You might have a question in Turkish or in English, and you want to get it more precise. So a question I could define here is if we, for example, closed all the ventilation and the doors and everything in this room, and I spoke for much too long, how much time could we survive in until all the air ran out? That would be a typical question we might want to define. Hopefully not one I'm going to test out here. So that's defining a question, getting it clear what it is we're trying to work out. What is the decision we're trying to take or the understanding we're trying to get? The next step is to translate this to mathematics. You know, you're familiar with equations or matrices or just multiplications. Why do we bother to translate this? What's the point of translating it from Turkish to mathematics? Well, the point is this, that for hundreds of years we have ways to work out answers from questions that are in this abstract form. And the reason we can do that is because a lot of very, very different questions have the same mathematical form. So we have a relatively small number of techniques for working out many, many things that appear to be very different questions. So that's why we bother to translate it to maths. Another term for this step 2 is abstracting. We are abstracting the question to a mathematical form. Okay, so the step 3 is we say, okay, we've got the question. Maybe the question is an equation. How are we going to get the answer? And that's this magical step 3 where we compute it. That takes the question to the answer in an abstract form. So we then get some answer, maybe x equals 3. And then we are going back the other way and we're interpreting the result. We're saying, well, given that x equals 3, did that mean we have 3 hours of time in the room before the air stops? So we're trying to understand whether we got a result. So we're taking it back to the original question. So that is the process of mathematics. And sometimes this process runs over a very quick period. When you're in primary school, you're doing this in a few minutes or seconds. Sometimes it may be a whole lifetime. Maybe you win a Nobel Prize for going through this process, basically, and figuring something out that nobody's figured out before. Now, the big problem we have in schools around the world is we are spending almost all of our time learning step 3 by hand. And that means the other 3 steps we are learning less of. So what we ought to be doing is using computers to do step 3, which is what happens in the real world, and using humans much, much more for steps 1, 2, and 4. We need humans to be defining the questions still. We need humans to be helping the translation to maths. Computers will do some of that, but humans still need to do that. And we need humans to interpret the results on much harder problems than they're doing today with much more experience. And another way to understand what mathematics is to think of it as this problem-solving process where you're going up a helix. And you may go up this several times to refine your answer, and eventually you have an answer that you're satisfied with at the end. And that's, in a sense, what you're doing. Maths is a problem-solving process. And one thing I like to show sometimes is that this is a typical equation that you would have to solve at school. And one of the reasons to have computers do this is so that if I, for example, make this slightly more complicated, I might have some problem to solve that is a cubic, and I then evaluate it, you get a rather more complicated result. Now, in fact, that's a result that most students after many years of study, could not do by hand. And in fact, it gets even more exciting than that. If I go and talk to my phone, solve x cubed plus 2 equals 2y, and y minus x equals 5. And Siri willing, we will hopefully get an answer here, which we have, and I'm just going to try and show you on the screen. There is the answer. I'm just holding it this way. It's the answer with lots of nice plot and all sorts of things from our Wolfram Alpha through Siri to that equation. So the thing I want to ask you is, I've talked to my phone in a few seconds, and I've got an answer to an equation that most students, after 10 years of study or more, could not answer by hand. So why are we trying to get students to pretend to be a computer rather than learning higher powered, higher problem solving skills? The machine does this stuff very well now. We don't need humans to do it. And so that is a key aspect of the change we need to make to empower students for the AI age. So when you look at a maths curriculum today, another thing that's funny about it is it's labeled by the details of the mechanics of the mathematics. Similar triangles, matrices, surds. I particularly didn't like surds myself, etc. What really we want is a problem-centered approach. Actual problems that you might want to solve. So here are a few examples. What's the perfect password for your login? Typical problem that any 7 or 8-year-old student has. Can I pick a password so that my friends don't break into my account? Right? Typical kind of problem, right? What is a good password? How do computers how do people break passwords? How do passwords get Can I think of a password that's going to be less breakable than another password? Am I normal? A good teenage problem. Can mathematics help me figure out if I'm normal? Can I do data analysis on other people? I have games. How do I control my game? What is the best controls that I could set? Is it a joystick in different ways, or is it a wheel, or is it, how do I decide what the dimensions of control of my game might be? Are my friends cheating? Can I figure out whether they're cheating in a test by doing data analytics on it? But also, how many levels of friends are we separated by in Facebook? What's a beautiful shape? I mean, these are not necessarily all questions that have to relate to very technical things. A beautiful shape. Architects have thought for many hundreds of years about what geometry makes a beautiful shape. So the key question, the key issue I want to bring, if you remember nothing else from this talk, I think this is important. If you remove the computer from education and from maths education, you will remove most of the context of the use of that mathematics. So what do I mean by that? You see, in the real world today, mathematics is so important to most people, to our societies, because it is so useful for problem solving. Why is it so useful? It's so useful because computers have enabled mathematics to be used across all these different fields we talked about. Biology, science, art, not just physics, not just mathematics itself, not just accounting. Most areas in life now have computation. But they didn't before computers existed. So in real life, there was no use of mathematics in biology, a little bit, but not much. There was no use in social sciences, and so forth. If we remove the computer in education, you remove all of those possible problems that students might try and solve. You can't do them. There is no biology with maths, really, without computers. So the only way of getting the rich problems that I just showed you, the only way of having those work in the classroom is by having a computer there that the students can use for calculating. Because those problems otherwise aren't real. You can't use lots of data points. You can't have 1 million data points to work with. The other problem with removing the computer is one that particularly many policymakers do not understand, which is that when you have a computer, you have new tool sets for working with problems. So we heard a lot earlier about machine learning. Machine learning is a tool that's been very, very useful in recent times in helping you to solve problems. Machine learning is only possible because we have high-powered computers. The idea of machine learning has been around for a long time, actually, but it's only now possible because computers are fast enough. So you can't learn about machine learning in school if you don't have a computer, because you can't apply it. On the other hand, machine learning is actually quite an easy thing to understand in concept. And there's no reason why in primary school you can't apply machine learning. But there are many, many tool sets. Machine learning is an important one, but there are many other tool sets for mathematics. And you need to cover all of those, or their existence, and allow people to use them with a computer. So if you don't have the computer, you end up with a very small number of tool sets that we have today in mathematics. Solving equations, for example. Arithmetic of different sorts. But there are many, many thousands of tool sets, and it's important to have them all available. So here's a typical problem that we've tried with students in school. And in this example, we divided the class in half, and we told half of the class to toss a coin in reality and note whether it was heads or tails and type it in. And we asked the other half of the class to cheat, like I'm doing now, and just not actually do the experiment, but just type in H or T for heads or tails. Here's the question. When you send all the results back to the teacher, can the teacher tell who's cheated and who hasn't? And the amazing answer is usually yes. So I typed these in, as you see, I cheated, and I didn't pass many of the tests. So I could pretty much say the data I sent in there was a cheat. I didn't actually do the experiment. If you compare that to, let's see, what do I want to do? Random choice of, let's say, H and T. Let's put this in. So I'm going to do a simulation now on my computer. So I'm going to semi-cheat, because I'm basically going to get the computer to generate this list as if I'd actually done the experiment, but I'm not actually just going to type it in. So I'm kind of simulating what I expect to happen, because I'm not actually going to do the experiment now. And I'm going to paste these in and see if I can, let's see if this works. And you see, in fact, when the computer did it, it passed all 5 tests. So that's amazing. By looking at the pattern of the data, I can tell whether I cheated, whether somebody cheated. And most students are amazed by this. It's like, how could you tell? Well, this is an early example of, simple example of the sort of fraud detection that people do for credit cards, that banks do, for example. And, it's very interesting then. You ask the students, how do you think the computer figured this out? And they come up with all these theories. And in fact, it's to do with the sequence of how most humans overcorrect when they type in the pretend version, so that they do it too evenly compared to the reality of the physics. And so, you can look for patterns in the data, and the kids come up with lots of possibilities for how you might do that. And that's the kind of thinking that we want them to work out. How might I get a computer to work out how to analyze whether this data works this way or that way? That's typical of what we need in the modern world. Now, another thing we've been doing is to build, in a sense, modules that allow people to work through a lot of these things. How do you deliver this new subject in the classroom? And there are lots of examples. So we've been building sort of a way to deliver this, in a sense. And this is an example of a cycle race in Ireland, actually. And the question is, could you learn how to cycle this faster? With different models and so forth. And what we've actually ended up doing is building both a teacher and a student edition. So you see these orange boxes are to help teachers know what to do in this. But you see, in this sort of material, you have things like, here we've got quite a complicated model for how much power you can produce when you're cycling. And the start of this is, okay, you're handed this model. can you understand different effects of this, and can you answer certain questions about that, and so forth. And then later on, there's more of a putting together new ideas about how you might do things. So this is a typical route. This is the way you might start somebody off thinking computationally more, by guiding them through different processes and getting them help when they need a piece of mathematics, getting that pulled in to help them. Well, when people have got a little bit more engaged with how they might do that computational thinking, it's also great to have projects and things that they can do where they can do it more openly. See, the result we want in the end is you hand somebody a computer, you hand them a problem, and the student can work out how to think computationally, saying, okay, I know all these tools that are available on the computer, this is the problem, can I work out the best solution? And so in our summer schools, some of the things we've done exactly do that. How can I model hurricanes? How do you analyze big data? These are all examples that students have actually produced in different ways. And are there patterns in New York City accidents, traffic accidents, for example? Can you see why those might be? So those are more independent learning things that you get to after you've been structuring the problems more. So I hope that's given you a little insight into computational thinking, how you might teach it, and the kind of changes we need in the subject. Let me spend a few minutes on, and you can extend these in questions afterwards, but objections to what I'm saying. People sometimes say, I don't agree with you. And I thought I would list a few of the ways they say that. So, the first objection usually is, you need to get the basics first. How can you start doing something more advanced before you have the basics? And I usually start by answering this by saying, basics of what exactly? So, are the basics, but I think what they mean by this is you need to learn how to do your calculating by hand before you get a computer to do it for you. Because otherwise you'll somehow not succeed in understanding what's going on. But you see, I don't think that's correct. I think you need basics of the process that I showed you, the four-step process of doing mathematics. But that's very different from the basics of how a computer calculates. You don't necessarily need to know how to calculate before you use a computer to calculate. And in fact, if you do, you end up learning much less about the whole sequence of problem solving. And I sometimes say it's a bit like driving a car. In order to learn to drive a car, do you have to know how a car works? Well, not really. You did 100 years ago when cars and drivers, when people who drove cars were all mechanics and people who built the cars, you kind of needed to know that. But nowadays, cars and driving cars is a very different process to building a car or to even maintaining a car. So there's a disconnect between learning to drive and learning to maintain a car. And so there is in mathematics. There's a disconnect between applying mathematics, computer-based mathematics, and learning how you would build mathematics in a system like our Mathematica, for example. And they're rather different. You don't have to be an automotive engineer to learn how to drive a car. And that's the world we're now in with mathematics. Now there's this automation layer. You don't need to know how to do the calculating by hand. And that gives you great empowerment. If everyone who needed to know how to drive a car also needed to know how to build the car, you wouldn't have many people being able to drive. And the same thing applies really with mathematics. Here's another one. Computers dumb maths down. They make it all too simple so that we're not thinking anymore. So I really disagree with this one. And the question I always ask people back is, if you look in the outside world, science, engineering, places where computers have been applied a lot in the last few decades, have they got simpler? Have they got less intellectual, less conceptual? No way. They've got much more complex. In fact, that's some of the reason people are so concerned to make the mathematics in schools be good, so that we can have more humans who are able to do these subjects. So computers in engineering and science and all these places have in fact enabled harder problems to be attempted. They've made the problems harder. They've actually made the subject more conceptual, more difficult, more intellectual. Same in schools. If you use computers the right way, you can use them the wrong way, of course, but if you use them the right way, they also will make the subjects more conceptual. Now, one of the things that we've ended up doing is to decide what is it, the outcomes that we really need from students over the years that they study their core subjects, and particularly their mathematics. And so you can look at this on our website, but we've put together a list of outcomes for mainstream maths, and they're very different from the outcomes that you see in most curricula. For example, confidence to tackle new problems. If you've spent many years learning mathematics and you can never tackle a new problem with it, as I would imagine most people in the audience, right? Most people who've ever learned mathematics for their life, when you ask them, how would you apply the mathematics you've learned in your life? If you don't happen to be a maths teacher or you don't happen to be a scientist, you'd probably say, I'm not sure actually I've used too much of the mathematics I learned at school. So you need to have confidence to tackle it, and there are many other aspects to this which are important. I mean, I think one of them is managing computations. How do you manage the process of applying mathematics? It's not trivial. It's like managing a company. It's not a trivial thing to be able to do. Another question people ask me is, how does computational thinking, maths, and coding fit together? So, as I understand it in Turkey, there is a drive to have people learn coding, and I think that's a good thing. But how does coding relate to mathematics, relate to computational thinking? Well, I've tried to summarize here. In a sense, computational thinking is a way to think about life, as I've tried to explain. Mathematics is a particular set of knowledge within that. And coding is interesting. Coding, in a way, is how you express your ideas. People think of coding as just telling the computer what to do. But actually, one problem, remember I mentioned the four-step process. Step 2 of that process is abstraction, how you write down what you're saying in an abstract language. What language are you going to use for that? Well, traditionally you use mathematical notation, nice squiggly things that you have when you write mathematics. But that isn't very efficient. It doesn't cover a very wide range of what you need to be able to write down. The modern way to write that down is computer code. And it's important that people understand how to write their ideas down in computer code so that they can express what they think. And I thought I would try and do this myself now live by writing you a little program. Let's see if I can get this right. So what I'm going to do is I thought, here's, as you can see, an image of me from my camera. And what I want to do is set up that image, and then I want to show that image at the same time as showing a rectangle blocking out my face. So I thought it was at about the time of the talk when you might want to not see me anymore. You've seen me enough. And so I thought I might try and block out my face with a routine here that will hopefully, if I've done this correctly, in fact, do a detection of my face, and there you go. I've actually managed to block out my face with a rectangle. So in a sense, what I've done here is written down my idea, and I've abstracted it to mathematics, and I've put it in a language, and by the way, the computer can execute this. And this is the thing that finds a face, and this is the rectangle to put over it, and so forth. But in a sense, this shows some sort of connection between the mathematics of geometry and coding. And that's a typical example that you can do. By the way, if you do a few more lines of Wolfram language code, you can do things like try and detect facial expressions. And if I smile, it can hopefully get that right. Actually, a more embarrassing one to do is facial age. Oh my gosh, no, that's very bad. So these things aren't necessarily accurate. Oh my gosh, I look much older than I am. But if I go back to the facial expression, let me, now if this works correctly, I can hopefully even tweet that, and it may come up in my Twitter stream at Conrad Wolfram. This is not, let's see if that actually worked, but anyway, let's
that was the code, by the way, that was used to do that, that generation. By the way, the language I was using there is our own Wolfram language. And one of the things we tried to do is combine mathematics with coding so you can, at a very high level, write things down. So you may like to play with that a little bit, particularly if you're not a mathematics teacher. So the thing that's exciting, actually, is you can pull in many pieces of data from biology, from history, from language, and so forth, and you can combine them with code. So you can make exciting things rather quickly, much more quickly than you would have done with a sort of traditional type of language. And there are many examples you can find of projects and things that have been done using that. And by the way, while I'm about it, there are some other cool things you might want to look for. This is Wolfram Alpha, which you can access, and you can do things like, say, you know, population of Istanbul, you know, versus London or something like this, and it'll go off and actually compute that result, and it'll tell you, you know, assuming London means the United Kingdom, not in Canada, this is the history of the population and so forth. You can see that Istanbul's population has grown much quicker than London's has. That is interesting, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, they're very close in number of people in each area now, interestingly. But that wasn't true in that crossed over, that probably wasn't true some time ago. So anyway, so those are the kinds of things, and there are many more kind of computational queries you can do there. Another thing definitely to look at is the demonstrations project. So we have about 12,000 sort of interactive apps from all areas of, and you can just look at these and play with them. And these allow you to, you know, do lots of different things, and maybe you can even get some students to submit some in due course. And explorations and computational essays and other things that you might look at. So I want to start to draw this to a close, but I want to mention a few things. One question I'm often asked is, how can we motivate people, particularly in mathematics, better? And often people find mathematics and computation very hard and demotivating compared to other subjects. And really my answer is solve harder problems. You need problems that relate to their life. Messy problems, hard problems, real life problems that seem relevant to that student's life at that time. So lead with real problems and use the abstract mathematics to help you solve those problems. Don't do it the other way around. Don't start with very abstract mathematics and then hope you get to some problem. And the other thing is use it in all subjects. Don't be frightened to use mathematics in other subjects, but you need to have the right mathematics to do that. In order to make this change happen worldwide, I founded computerbasedmath.org, and we've also got computationalthinking.org that have some ways to think about this. And since the summary of what I've been trying to do is build a curriculum assuming computers exist. And it's, you know, there are some sort of ways to think about this, but it takes some time to understand what to do. Another thing that we've learned is that when you think about the subject you're teaching and the curriculum, particularly if you're a policymaker, it's good to build it backwards. It's good to start with what you actually might want to deliver to teachers and students and work back from that and then build the specification for the curriculum. Today, in most countries, the curriculum is built by writing out a specification and then hoping you can make the textbooks that apply to students and so forth. Another very exciting thing we can do is reorder the curriculum so that we have conceptual complexity, not computational complexity, happening in that order. So what do I mean by that? There are many places today in mathematics where, in a sense, how hard something is to calculate means it comes very late in the curriculum. So calculus is a very standard example. People learn to do integrals very late. They learn to do integrals very late because they're hard to calculate. They're not very hard to understand, actually. You know, how much wood do I need to make this podium? You know, how much water could my water cup hold? These are questions that where it's, you know, it's slicing that in little segments to see if you can add them all up. These are quite easy to understand for most primary school children. They're just hard to calculate. But a lot of those can become much earlier in the curriculum if you assume computers. That's why I've put here calculus for 10-year-olds. And the other thing I want to make sure you understand is the difference, which we started on the beginning, between the effects of AI on the subject and on the pedagogy. So throughout most of this talk, I've been talking about changing the subject that we learn because computers now exist. Okay, the subject has to match the real-world subject. And the real-world subject has changed very fast over the last few decades because computers now exist. And we heard that in the talk before about chess, for example, that computers can beat humans at chess. The speed of change is very dramatic. We must reflect that in the subject that we teach. But of course, there's also how we teach that subject. Do teachers still do exactly the same things as they did in the past, now that computers exist? And I think there are many new ways. I think teachers are very important in this new life, by the way. I don't think that teachers, some people think you can just have computers replace the teacher and somehow they'll be able to teach the student. I don't think that's true. But I think what teachers need to do is a little bit different to what they would have done in the past. So in a sense, AI is driving the need for the change, but it's also providing some of those tools. And if you look at what can happen on the pedagogical side of this, you can personalize your teaching more, assessments can be richer, you can bring in much better contexts, etc., etc. Whereas on subjects, the key thing that I've been saying is you need to change what the human is learning, including how they interact with the computer, including what's for the computer and what's for the human. And you should always use the real world as the guide. So really, to close this, I want to leave you with this thought, which is, in a sense, I asked a question at the beginning. How should education react, given that we now have this new AI age? And there's sort of two options to that. Option one is you assume the machinery doesn't really exist, and you teach the students to learn the same things as they learned before, more or less to pretend to be the machines. The other option is you stand on the power of automation. You say, okay, we have this machinery. The machinery works rather well. We are going to go to the next level up. The humans are going to have to learn the next level up of understanding. And then, but together with the machinery, we will go further. So in a sense, my argument is that always wins. If you look at previous history, in the end, do not try and have humans compete with successful machines, because they'll lose. We have successful machines now for a particular type of thinking, of AI. Don't try and compete with that with the humans. Try and put the human on the next level up and work with those machines to take further, more sophisticated decisions, solve harder problems. Now, what we want is first-rate human problem solvers, not third-rate human calculators or computers. I look back, and when we launched our Mathematica software back in 1988, Steve Jobs, who started Apple, came up with this quote, and it's rather an interesting quote 30 years on. Mathematica will revolutionize the teaching and learning of math by focusing on the prose without getting lost in the grammar. And I think it's a great quote, because it's sort of saying, a little bit like what I'm saying, you need to focus on what you're trying to solve with mathematics, not get lost in the mechanics. The reason I highlighted will is because that's the only thing that's wrong with this quote. Jobs was absolutely right that this is what should happen. It just hasn't happened yet, right? We're still waiting in schools for this to happen. And I think that's the message of my thing. We need to be prepared for the computational knowledge economy. This is the economy after the knowledge economy, which we've had, where knowing things was important. Now we're at the next level of knowing how to work with the automation, the computational knowledge economy, as I've taken to calling it. And it's worth thinking, how can Turkey be an early country in this? No country has succeeded yet in really getting to this change. And the playing field is open. It's a new game on a new playing field, and every country can compete on doing that. And Turkey, I think, is in as good a position as any to do that and to leapfrog other countries. So I hope you can join our journey to transform education for the AI age. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'd be happy to take any questions. And
well, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. I really appreciate your talk, the idea of the big picture. Actually, empower the human development director. That's why I'm very curious about it, and I really want to know more about it. But I have a question. The question itself is just when we look at the immigrant cultures, I'm not talking about my country, just talking about the big picture because you're working with many countries in the world. How does that work with the immigrant cultures? Because the idea of dependency may make them uncomfortable. Have you seen any examples of it?
so I think your question is, how does sort of computational thinking fit with immigrant cultures in terms of, does that make them more uncomfortable or more comfortable? Or you see, one of the interesting things about this is mathematics and computation are pretty much a universal worldwide language. So actually it's very interesting, and in fact I suppose our country, our company, Wolfram Research, is a good example of this. We have virtually every culture you can imagine in our company, and they coexist very nicely because they have this central way, this common way of computational thinking to some extent, that is perhaps more different from people's own individual culture. So I would actually say often we find that people coming to a different country and things find that actually there's more, if they have computational thinking, they can connect more easily with other people who are native to that country in their computational thinking than they might be able to do on other levels. I'll mention another thing, which is not your question, but is an interesting issue, in my view, to do with language. And I'm sure you know this better than I do as a director of foreign languages. So I mentioned about different computer languages for how you write down your technical ideas. And it's quite interesting to compare computer languages to human languages, and to think about the difference between those languages and what that means. So one of the things I don't speak, I'm afraid to say, my fine British education resulted in me knowing virtually no foreign languages at all. I did some Latin, which isn't spoken in many places today, and some French and things, but and some ancient, anyway. The point is that people think a bit differently when they speak different languages, because the structures that they put in are a bit different. And that's true of computer languages too. So when people learn to abstract to one language rather than another language, they tend to think a little bit differently about the problems. So I just bring that up as an interesting issue, because when you're choosing which languages people should learn for coding, it actually does make a difference to their pattern of thought as to what they tend to learn. Now, what we try to do with Wolfram language is to make it very broad, so there are many, many structures, so you don't have to be deciding on one structure up front. But that's just, our particular way of doing things. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
My question is, do you differentiate in your way of educating mathematics between the users of mathematics and the creators of new mathematics?
Okay, it's a very good question. Do I distinguish between the users and the creators? Actually, this is a rather deep question. So let me start on a slightly different basis set, which is, do I distinguish between core subjects in schools and subjects that are interesting to people but are not necessarily for everyone? I think we do carefully need to distinguish these two. So here's what I mean. The question about, let's say, mathematics education is not if somebody's interested in learning how mathematics works internally, should they be allowed to do that or not allowed to do that? Yes, absolutely. If they get excited about that, it's a valuable thing they have to learn, that they might want to learn. What I'm concerned about, and most of my talks have been concerned about, is what should everyone be pushed to learn? And I think that the subject for people to be pushed to learn is the use of mathematics, not necessarily inventing new mathematics. It's how do you use mathematics to empower your life? Because I think that's the only thing you can justify everyone learning. There are very few subjects, by the way, that around the world that everyone is supposed to learn. I mean, your own language is typically one, history is typically another, and mathematics is typically a third. Why is mathematics in that group? Well, I think it's the use of mathematics that's really supposed to be in that group. Now, to come back to your question about, do I differentiate those two? Yes, I mean, I think in all subjects there's a difference between the subject itself, an interest in the subject itself, from the use of the subject. I think a question you might ask also is my approach going to lead to fewer people who are mathematicians, who are actually interested in mathematics itself? Actually, I think the opposite is true, and here's why. Right now, there are, in most maths curricula, a lot of students get really put off mathematics at an early stage. And I think some of those students are actually potentially very interested in mathematics itself. But the early mathematics they're forced to do is not something they're very interested in. It seems too simple, and they just don't engage in it. And so I actually think, with the kind of computer-based maths I'm talking about, you would find more mathematicians in the future who actually is a bigger funnel of people who might say, actually, now I'm interested in how you use mathematics. Maybe I'd be interested in what's inside, what's under the hood. And I would like to become an actual person to invent new bits of mathematics. So I think there is definitely a connection, but I think it's a little bit complex. And thank you very much for that question, which is a very good one. One final point, I'm sorry, I can't resist a final point on this, which is people who build systems like Mathematica, who build new mathematics and things, often the mathematics they're using for that is not the hand calculating they would have learned in a traditional maths curriculum. So it's actually new mathematics, but it's different. And actually, I see in the audience one of our developers from Wolfram, who now lives in Turkey, Tawfiq, who is an example of somebody who has used his technical skills in working on building out technology and things. So, thank you. Yes.
Sanırım nasıl olacak bilemiyorum. Siz...
Let me put this on for a second. Go ahead.
Evet. Öncelikle bize vermiş olduğunuz bilgiler son derece kıymetli. Şunu anlayabilir miyiz acaba? Ta eski aslında Platon'a geri dönersek, matematiği yapmış olduğu, makinelerin, bilgisayarların yapabildiklerinin yanında insanın kendi yaratıcılığı, merak duygusunu, bunu geliştirmesi gerekiyor. Sanırım bizim de çocuklarımıza özellikle makinenin nasıl çalıştığını bilmekten de çok onu nasıl kullanabilirim, nasıl daha farklı şeyler yapabilirimi öğretmemiz gerekiyor. Galiba burada da sanırım biraz evvel eğitimle ilgili olan branşları saydığınızda felsefe de son derece önemli bir yer tutuyor. Nasıl düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda? Çünkü ta ilk çağına baktığınızda matematikte de geometrinin kurucusu olarak Platon'a da baktığınızda da felsefe ile matematiğin ilişkisi son derece önemli. Siz ne düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda?
Okay, very interesting question about the relationship between philosophy and mathematics. And I think, the way I think about this is that there are different ways to think about life. And there are what you might call philosophical ways to think about it. There are theological ways, there are many other ways. And computational thinking, in a sense, is one other way. And it's a way, particularly right now empowered because the machinery can help us so much with that thinking. But I think, actually, as you point out, these forms of thinking have some crossover, and they reinforce each other quite well. So actually, I think if you learn philosophy and how to think philosophically, actually it fits quite well with how you might think computationally and the steps you might go through. And I think it's also true of things like medicine. You know, if you think about how doctors diagnose things, and in fact how that's going to change now with AI, that's a crucial form of thinking that actually is benefited by learning computational thinking, in my view. By the way, a couple of things to note about the philosophers and mathematicians in the past. One argument I sometimes have with mathematicians is they say, you know, there's this ancient subject of pure mathematics. I don't really agree with them. Most mathematics that was being done, not all, but most ancient mathematics was applied. I mean, the reason why some of the mathematics was invented was largely to solve a problem. And it may have ended up generating a new abstract form, but actually it was originally to solve a problem. And it was only, I would suppose you could argue, in the 19th century that pure mathematics got very separated from applied mathematics in the way it is today. And by the way, there's another curiosity of why computer science got separated from mathematics, which is itself quite curious. I would say they should have been similar. So I actually agree with, I think, the tenor of your question, which is that as we have so many more directions and tool sets in life, actually we need to bring together some of this thinking to be more collected than it has been recently, and stop having all our students just go off on one specialism or another. I think they need this overall ability to think. And it is one final point. My mother was actually a philosopher. She was a philosophy professor in Oxford. And so as a child, I used to ignore all philosophy because I would have to discuss it with my mother. So I'm afraid I know less philosophy than I should. But that's just my individual problem. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
Hi. My name is Taufik. I work for Manager for Engineering in Wolfram. So earlier in the video which we've seen, in early 90s it was muscle power getting changed, and that was the transformation. And right now the intelligence is what we are concentrating. How about the emotions? Because I deal with a lot of human emotions. So I deal with a lot of humans, and human emotions are really complicated to deal with. And I work with a lot of broad range of cultures, and
sure.
Like in Wolfram, as you said, we have, I don't know how many countries we have in our company. So
I mean, I think, again, this follows from the last question. So emotions and understanding human emotion and intelligence is in itself a complex process of thinking, maybe implicit or explicit. And I think that's a very important, I mean, I know in educational circles right now, a lot of people have worried, and I think correctly, about resilience and confidence and and you know, how to handle different cultures and different emotions. And I think that's a really critical point. Actually, one thing I've noticed also as being a CEO of a company, some of the younger employees we have are so used to being on social media that they are less used to interacting in person with each other. So this is something we need to correct, right? Because when they come to an office environment, sometimes they're not so used to how to interact with other human beings except when they are on their phones or so forth. So I think there are important things we need to adjust for the new technology. Thanks. We had a question. I don't know who's next, but...
Teşekkür ederim. Ben Türkçe soracağım. Psikiyatristim ben. Yapay zekanın eğitimde üstün zekalılar ve normal zekalar için kullanılabileceğini düşündüm. Acaba hudut zeka, yani zekası daha düşük olanlar içinde yapay zeka eğitime katılabilir mi diye merak ettim. Teşekkür ederim.
Yes, I mean, I think, so I mean, there's several parts to this. I think AI, the thing of AI, it's not quite clear what one defines AI to be. I mean, there are many different strands of AI. I think computing in general right now is a huge help for educating all levels. One of the reasons I think it's particularly helpful at the high end is because students can have access to any subject they want to study, potentially, whatever school they're in. I mean, in the past, you know, if you were in a small school somewhere and there isn't a teacher of a specialized subject, psychology, for example, you're out of luck. You're a student, you can't learn that subject. Nowadays, of course, there is ability to have that expertise come in from remotely, either through videos or through remote teachers or in other ways. And I think we'll see more of that empowerment as AI takes off. I mean, one of the things you can think about is that one potential achievement you can have is, in a sense, take the best expertise from a subject and turn that into software that will guide a student in different ways. One thing I would say that you have to be careful about, not to use the computer to be too closed-ended. And what I mean is the following. If, say, you tell somebody, here's a blank screen, and you need to write a program to solve this problem, they have to engage a lot. I mean, it's a blank screen. They have to figure out what to do. If you spoon feed each thing, so that it's like you've got this question, now answer this question, now answer this, they potentially can disengage. So what you have to do is not use the, you don't want too much pedagogical overlay on the computer. You want the computer as a raw tool that the student can use as much as possible. And I think that's got real power for particularly, you know, brighter students who want to go further. They can write a harder program to do more complicated things. And again, it's important to be able to do that with as much real data and context as possible, so that they're not just writing programs for their own right. So, interesting. Good. I don't know how many more. I'm happy to take any more questions as time allows, but maybe. Okay, fine. Okay, thank you. I'll just maybe take my computer and then. Okay. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, I will.
Sayın Conrad Wolfram'a konuşması için teşekkür ediyor ve yerine almadan önce günün anısına hediyelerini vermek üzere İSTEK Okulları Genel Müdürü Sayın Ali İhsan Özyazgan'ı sahneye davet ediyorum. Sayın Esin Elmas'ı sahneye davet ediyorum.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Shall I? Yes. Thank you.